Okay, we're going to start on time. I think everything's set. I welcome you to Wednesday office hours, 6 o'clock Eastern time, and it's the 29th of April, um, 60 days into the war in Iran, needless to say, and also another attack on the United States Voting Rights Act today. So if there's memorable things today, that's it. Today we're going to talk about economics and semiotics, and I'm not going to read it all the way through because I probably wouldn't get there. But I mean, the page says that it can be done in 33 minutes. I don't think it can, but we'll see. And I'm not going to read it directly. The front end of this is to give you a better overview, and it's not the best overview, but what's interesting about the particular article I chose was that it's an introductory article to a collection of things that, for me, is just simply a walk down memory lane for in terms of theories of semiotics, which was really good, and it's a good overview. I mean, there are things it doesn't touch, and whatever, can't do everything, but I think it's a good introduction to that. And what's also nice, of course, is that it draws the parallel, and it's not simply a parallel, but that there were moments of integration, of synchrony with economics. And ultimately, and the push that I made, well, those many years ago, was to try and see whether we could get that to work within the context of a political economy, taking off, of course, from Baudrillard and the political economy of science, which is nice in theory, but you really need to. Baudrillard himself needed to work a little bit harder on that, but maybe he didn't have an army of graduate students to work on that. So anyway, um, I'm stalling, I suppose. All right. So I begin with a little thing on commentary on Marx and Leibniz. And Marx expressed a deep personal admiration for Leibniz in an 1870 letter to Frederick Engels, when their friend Ludwig Kugelmann sent Marx two pieces of wallpaper from Leibniz's study, which had been demolished in Hanover. Talk about kind of, you know, mining the debris of, whatever. Anyway, which had been demolished in Hanover. Marx framed two pieces of wallpaper from Leibniz's study and hung them in his study. Now, that's a whole story we could probably pursue in much more interesting and literary ways, but we won't. Marx wrote to Engels, "You know my admiration for Leibniz." Now, just that act, and of course, it could be apocryphal, but it sounds certainly possible, because I think Marx wasn't about to sort of pay money, but except to pay money for getting things framed. So that's interesting. And then, of course, we can go on and on about why Leibniz was interested in this set of what was he didn't refer to as semiotic, but is clearly a relationship between among science and a material world. So we can see that there are overlaps and interesting elements. Some idiots would go down and try and track down more specific elements of when Marx talks about science. Marx does talk about science, but I don't think he really meant it in that way, and that's not important. What is important is that there is a literature. It's an interesting and useful literature. It's a literature that I've followed since graduate school. So it's that means it's incredibly tedious. So on the other hand, it never got pursued to the point where it needed to be. And of course, as you'll notice here, that there are very few American scholars who would pursue that angle. But It's an important angle. There are actually scholars in the United States who do pursue that angle, albeit I think from uh, a non-economic angle, mainly from sociology, anthropology, a variety of other things, because they have other agendas going on in their research. Mine is slightly different. So, uh, my admiration for Leibniz. So that's where I wanted to sort of start today because I think it's kind of useful to think about. And namely, and this is a Charles Sanders Peirce, and yes, that's how it's pronounced. Namely, a sign is something A, which brings something B, its interpretant sign determined or created by it, into the same sort of correspondence with something else, something C, its object. So here you have three things: a sign, an interpretant, and an object. And you'll note that in prior yakking, I talked about, sort of that there are three things, there are triads of things. There are, you can talk about it in terms of basic human communication, where they're in a dyad, there's two people, but then there's the relationship between the two people. That's the third thing there. And I think that hopefully you'll agree that that's one of the biggest problems. It is in fact the crux of all kinds of other ways in which you can approach human relationships. But anyway, that's a whole nother story and a whole different lecture. Charles Sanders Peirce is interesting and useful for that, just from that position. Now, there are idiots in the world, some of whom run our country, um, and they think they're incredibly clever. And so one of them posted that it would be better to rebrand ICE, our immigration uh, and customs enforcement agency, into a something called national whatever ICE, which would turn it into, as an acronym, NICE, which would then, I presume, the person who made this little comment is insufficiently intelligent enough to think of it as humanizing nice, but I think that's what he meant. And so referring to it as nice would blunt any criticism we might have of ICE as being murderers, racists, etc. But that's just interesting. That's just an aside, and we can go on and on about how stupid that person is. Um, so anyway, I add another object, an interesting object, and because it represents the same semiotic problem, and it's a joke, using a visual image, but it does require a statement or a text to make it work. So there is the phrase biscuits and gravy, and Americans, particularly in the southeast of the United States, really are into biscuits and gravy. And, in personal experience, is that's kind of true. So anyway, without lapsing into personal experience, but the expression "these Americans are crazy, biscuits and gravy" is a disgusting combination, is of course taken from a non-American kind of point of view, and the sort of the play with this, of course, is that uh, here there are things that the British English would not call biscuits, uh, or they would call them biscuits, but it's not the same biscuit as in biscuit and gravy. And there's gravy here. I assume that's gravy. The brown stuff is gravy, needless to say. But anyway, so there's a little joke there, and it's very recent, but it does indicate, I think, in the larger picture. And yes, this is not going to be a lecture on either literary theory or George Miller or a whole bunch of other things. But it is about the expression, which is a useful expression and mentioned by other people, and we find it useful that it one of its sources or one of its ideas, even though it goes back to Plato, is Friedrich Nietzsche. So the prison house of language and the doors are closing behind us. George Miller talks about that. It uses it as a joke to close close the whole thing. He does. Uh, Prison House of Language is also something that Fred Jameson used in order to write one of his texts, which was a really good text. I mean, it's a good text for its place in history, that is, to explain the kind of structural connection between French structuralism and Russian formalism, and to suggest that there are, structural things that connect them and that we need to go beyond that, and I'll point that out in a second. So Nietzsche says, and this is better than I think the quote that's done in Blazing Saddles. Anyway, we have to cease to think if we refuse to do it in the prison house of language, for we cannot reach further than the doubt, which asks whether the limit we see is really a limit. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that you can build in there, and epistemological elements, Nietzsche's own, nihilism or nettiness, and a whole variety of other deconstructive possibilities. But that we're not going to go there today. In ordinary language, J.L. Austin notes, and I think with a reference to Nietzsche, but why track? I'd leave it to you to track that down. We are captive in the prison house of language. And of course, George Miller goes the next step further, and the doors are closing behind us. So anyway, that's the kind of source of the etymology of, or the source of such ideas. So in a more recent book by Patricia Hanna and Bernard Harrison, and they're referring to it in a much broader way and for a very different set of reasons in terms of discussing how to teach language. But anyway, in raising such doubts, we envisage the possibility that language, although it may seem the house of the mind, with windows opening on an extra-mental, extra-linguistic world, may in fact be a prison with none. So, these are all turns of phrases, and but we're going to go a little further today because we're going to ask this question that semiotics begins to open up and connects, as the article does, the idea that discussions of economics, political economy, can be connected to the human science, that is, the economic science and the human science of semiotics can be sort of bridged and without much trouble. And in fact, it was never too much trouble for some people. And not enough people are either well read or interested or tolerant enough to sort of deal with the interdisciplinary, the history of ideas component of these somewhat disparate disciplines. And yet, of course, the semiotic side, or at least the things that are connected to the semiotic side, are critiqued as being vestiges of Western Marxism, the Western Marxism that is anti-imperialist, et cetera, et cetera. So without referring to that a bit of silliness, we will move on, because that's a whole nother lecture. The title of Jameson's book, The Prison House of Language, refers to his central critique of structuralism and formalism, that they enclose thought within the structures of language, preventing a fuller understanding of how literature and culture interact with historical and social forces, because that's kind of the point of saying that economics and semiotics are, similar. And the point I want to make is that you can use various ideas like Saussurean, the linguistic theories of de Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, and Charles Sanders Peirce, another a philosopher who engaged in semiotics more specifically. But you can sort of link that together and look at a third term, a third part, and that is this material world, the economics of the material world, the political economy of the material world. So you have this interesting little threesome that, and as we know, any 3 points sort of establishes a plane, and that's for another lecture, I suppose. So this is from Fred's book. And what if one could go even further than this? In their years of reason, the formalists, that is the Russian formalists, and was due not only to the pressure of Stalinism, developed into literary historians of what one hesitates to call the traditional variety when they did not seek their fortune elsewhere in the historical novel and in the movies. And this is why Asa Berger, in the things that I've mentioned before, and you'll see some diagrams from it, talks about prop, P-R-O-P-P, because it does relate to this larger narrative question anyway. And of course, things that become film theory, blah, 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 blah. The formalist image of literary history as mutation is, as the reader will discover, both philosophically unsatisfactory and imaginatively stimulating. As for structuralism, remember we just talked about this. This is a comparison between structuralism and formalism, or an analysis, as it were. As for structuralism, who could claim that a thinker like Claude Lévi-Strauss, thanks to whom all the apparent outmoded reflections of Rousseau on the state of nature and the social contract have once more become the order of the day, thanks to whom recall that Levi-Strauss is an anthropologist, so we're talking about Rousseau and nature and social contract and other things. On the state of nature and the social contract have once more become the order of the day. Thanks to whom, in the midst of a stifling and artificial civilization, the meditation on the very origins of culture has been reawakened, has not made an impact on our thinking about history. And we will suggest in the following pages that if structuralism has any ultimate and privileged field of study, it may be found in the, yes, I just mentioned this, it's not the Geistesgeschichte, but, it's the history of ideas conceived of in a new and rigorous fashion. To say, in short, that synchronic systems cannot deal in any adequate conceptual way with temporal phenomena. So we're juxtaposing synchronic and the diachronic here to say, in short, that synchronic systems cannot deal in any adequate conceptual way with temporal phenomena, like history, is not to say that we do not emerge from them with a heightened sense of the mystery of diachrony itself. The mystery of diachrony. The point in this particular case is that, Fred talks about historicizing things, and of course that goes into Hegel and a bunch of other things, but that's kind of what we're looking at here, is that we have space, time, and its intersection, and in particular in cultural texts, and of course, as we've pointed out, in economic texts, where everything is historical. The idea of history itself has seemed to empty of content. Now that's sort of an interesting idea that pursued in a different way. Perhaps that is indeed the ultimate, and yes, this is a big word, but it means sort of fundamental or foundational or whatever, propedeutic value of the linguistic model. That is, to renew our fascination with the seeds of time. So all of these juxtapositions is meant to show that, and you could argue that, in fact, the book does argue for a kind of post-structuralism, whatever that may be, and of course be open to the criticism that it is sort of new Marxism or Western Marxism, and therefore anti-imperialist and blah, 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 blah. And let's just hold that in abeyance for a bit, because that's kind of what you're supposed to do as an academic. So anyway, I use stuff from Asa Berger's work, and I'll run through this quickly because we don't want to get bogged down in trying to have to explain everything. You can get the thing and read it for yourself. But there are, in terms of talking about a sign, remember I talked about sign, interpretant, and an object. Sign, interpretant, and an object. The sign itself can be divided further, and you'll find that some people spend their entire life, working out the taxonomy or typology of how many signs are there. Well, on the one hand, they're an infinite number in combination, and blah, 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 blah. But Peirce, for example, I think identifies, and I'm trying to do this from memory, 423 different kinds of signs. And of course, we're not going to do all 423, and I don't even know what for, they're just too confusing to me. But had I taken a different path in life, I probably would have found all 420 or studied all 423. But anyway, because Charles Sanders Peirce's papers are held in the United States. And as an American, I think he does represent the kind of polymath, I suppose, who can be admired or modeled or thought crazy. He's the kind of guy who probably would have gotten a Nobel Prize. But anyway, speaking of Nobel Prizes, icon, index, and symbol are the three columns here. On the fourth column, the first column there, signs signified by resemblance, causal connection, and convention. And note, of course, all three things operate in our world. We do things because stuff resembles stuff. We do stuff. We do things because is some connection as we interact with the world, and then there are things that structure that set of relationships, which is a convention. Now, examples that are used by Asa Berger here are that examples of signs are pictures and statues, iconography, as it were. Yes, entire fields built around that, right? Or the history of that and the practice of that. And then an index is the second row here, right? In our little, 3x3 matrix. Fire and smoke are indexical. That is, you don't need to necessarily see the fire in order to yell when the fire alarm goes off, or you see smoke that there is a fire, or you at least assume there's a fire, and you take appropriate action. Now, the third column here has, row 2, column 3, flags. Flags are problematic for all kinds of reasons because, flags can be placed upside down. I have a whole lecture on this, but, flags can be flown upside down to indicate distress. Is the burning of a 48-star American flag as blasphemous or blasphemous at all? In terms of the rule that applies to 50 star flags that some people try to create a fetish out of, that flag destruction acts, and the very contradiction of the First Amendment is to persecute people or prosecute people for burning American flags in terms of the First Amendment. But anyway, and some people are just, as I've said, stupid about that. Anyway, and so column 1, row 2, oh no, row 3, column 2. The process in which we're talking about icons is we see icons, we perceive them, we can even act virtually around them, because that's the kind of comment that people make about when we perceive statues. And they're, of course, idiots who think that, for example, putting a statue of Columbus is going to signify anything other than being an idiot. But anyway, excuse me. The next one over, column 2. Column 2, row 3, is indexical, requires that kind of inference or correlation or whatever, thinking about. You can figure out stuff because that's that fire and smoke thing. And when the fire alarm goes off, probably a fire, at least, you're being warned of a fire. It's a lot worse than for other kinds of things that a buzzer going off might warn you, but that's a whole nother story. Row 3, column 3, is that symbols, you only know symbols like flags because you've got to learn about them. And note, of course, that there are multiple flags that include in the same order and formulation, for example, red, white, and blue, or red, white, and green. And some of them have other things to help you out, but there are a couple of that you don't know actually which nation might be represented by that. And of course, you could get in trouble. And then again, you may not be. So I've spent far too much time talking about that. Needless to say, so Sarah talks about the difference between sound image, a signifier, of two types, of a sound image and a concept, and the thing itself, certainly. And we look at signs and symbols in the Saussurean idea. That is, we push it a little further and talk about there's a tree, we can see a tree, we can label it as a tree, quote unquote, but it means other things in other languages. Arbor, for example. And in fact, in this case, where you have the the text tree that you can utter, a sound image of, and then the tree that you see in front of you, even though that's, just a squiggle, but it is, take it for granted that's a tree. They're shared. They can be shared because you could use the same word arbor to signify that, and that's the whole point. Is that you have these intersections of ideas, and you need, as with our three terms, a way of interpreting all this stuff. It is how we negotiate the world. It is how we either avoid or create conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So, needless to say, a sign is a combination of signifier and signified. So it is that combination of the sound image, which can be, in more material terms, a sound or an image, and then the signified, and this is where it gets platonic, right? You have, it's an idealism to talk about it as a concept. And of course, if you apply this further in terms of trying to think about, transformational grammar or something else, uh, you can think about this in a whole variety of other ways. The simple way, of course, is to presume, of course, that there are all these lexical things out there that make up the corpus of language, and that they can be, there's bunches of things, and it's not infinite. It's relatively finite. Although, obviously poetry helps out, and neologisms occur, but and advertising occurs. But the point is that there's a finite set of rules that structure how we, that there's that word structure, how we combine things into sentences, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the point, is that there are ideas that we can see as sound images, et cetera, because we work them out because we talk to other people, or we can talk to ourselves, or a putative self. Whereas with concepts, there's a relatively finite set of things there. So there's the signified that is signified, and then there's the signifier, of which we could probably have a whole bunch. So we can see the same division here between something that is denotative, that is, it's there, like a dictionary. Dictionary is there. It denotates, right? And yet, to follow on, Umberto Eco talks about this, etc., is that it has a dictionary contains within it largely a variety of encyclopedic universes. So the history of dictionaries is kind of its own interesting path, because certain things just don't stay the same, or they disappear, or they kind of blah blah blah. So you could say that one thing is denotative, signifiers, like a dictionary, and yet the same object can have all these other possible meanings. And of course, idiots would always like to refer to, oh, well, we'll go to the dictionary and that'll explain it all. Well, it doesn't really, particularly in a real world. But anyway, but you can see how that little piece of argumentation is always, and yes, it is stupid, but that happens in the world. So there's the difference between the literal and the figurative, uh, which boils down ultimately to jokes. I mean, ultimately, that's the problem with the joke. We have literal things that are kind of twisted in figurative ways, and that's why we either get or don't get a joke. Joking about biscuits, for example. So there are obvious things that are in the dictionary, right? They're there, they're printed. There's, physical dictionary. We have very little. In fact, that may be its own kind of argument. But anyway, and then there are things that are inferred, they're connoted by the obvious. So there's that. And then uh, to go further down in our little column, the denotation describes. Now, the connotative or the connotative element of this is that meanings are suggested by the description. The descriptions, like any history, for example, include not only explanatory elements but interpretive elements. So you got to kind of parse through that, and of course, there's entire disciplines built on that, entire fields. They give out degrees in it. So whatever. And a denotation determines, or at least describes, as it were, a realm of existence. It seems it's describing the obvious and the literal, whereas the realm of myth, to go to the left column, It's more about inferred meanings, things that are signified in many ways, and that they're figurative. And, I didn't mean that. I meant this, right? 8647 is just four numbers. Anyway, obviously it isn't. So to go on further, we can follow this in a slightly different way, and rather, and this talks about the functionality of how language operates, right? And so, in a Caesarean idea, there are synchronic things that are more like synchronous things happen now immediately. There are synchronous things, and there are asynchronous things, of course, that unfold over time. They're recorded. They're whatever. So there is a way in which you could take these two axes, that is the synchronic and the diachronic, and uh, combine them. They're obviously combined whenever you analyze. So anything synchronic has diachronic elements, and anything diachronic has obviously synchronic elements. This is the difference between space and time, of course. Um, and you can see all the different ways you could talk about it. So when I talked about PROPP, this is the contrast that uh, Jameson is making between structuralism, like the Claude Lévi-Strauss structuralism, the French structuralism, as it were, and the Russian formalism, of which Prop is an example. He's that in the bottom row there. Now, hopefully, you sort of get what I'm talking about. And if you don't, well, we can probably have another conversation. And I'm not going to go through props, functional, all these different things, because you can argue that, as Prop, among others, do, that there's a logical connection between all these things. That is the function of something and what it might be describing. So here, H signifies, struggle, which is a hero and villain join in direct combat. That's one way which you could talk about it. And of course, you can see that this is a kind of taxonomy, right, or a typology. Um, and here there's seven dramatis personae in Prop's scheme. And you can see, hopefully, that all of these little ideas are being played with in something like Princess Bride, for example. All of these things are there. Um, but that it would destroy our appreciation of it, of course, if we tried to identify them all, or we had a little thing that could decode it. Well, let's not go there. That's okay. And then there's another concept called metaphor and metonymy, and I think I'm already losing enough time. The point is that we have elaborated and restricted codes in the world, and it's simply the difference between what is middle class and working classes is a coded set of relationships, that is, and we can describe them in a variety of complex ways, and they become even more complex in democracies. So anyway, codes are ways of organizing all of these matters. You can argue, you can analyze everything in a structuralist way, according to code questions, and double coding is a simple example of that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all that sort of stuff and the way in which you could talk about it. And then there's, of course, in our little pod, the possibility, and not that we should be doing that, needless to say, but I'm always amused by when we think in that way, film semiotics, and not just simply the semiotics of Christian Metz or whatever, uh, but it is a sign process. That is, it's an activity that involves signs. It is an abstraction. Of course, we know that film is always an abstraction, although it's made more "quote unquote" real, which is a whole nother set of questions. Televisual by um, television, for example, electronic means. But we see them all integrated in a variety of ways, including the production of meaning, which is, of course, a conceptual idea. And these signs pertain to moving pictures. Film semiotics is used for the interpretation of many art forms, often including abstract art. So that automatically builds out into, film represents not only narration, narrative, but a whole technology, a science. It also is about art. It's why the Film Academy talks about itself as art and science, and that's kind of what's going on. The point, of course, is that the abstraction connects all these together, or at least we could argue that, and that film occurs around the same moment, almost the same moment, of as modernity, and we can argue that for a whole bunch of other things. So you could probably get a degree in it. But anyway, so I won't go through that. This is like turned into a semiotics lecture, and I don't really want to do that. So you can apply it to television. You can, talk about film grammar, film sense, blah, blah, blah. That's all there. Um, the point is, it's indexical in that sense. And I, found this little thing on a slide that talks about that is a nice one, noting, of course, that nice is also indexical. That means it signifies stuff, but by no means am I going to consider a ICE agent nice. I mean, I can respect them as human beings and that they, if they follow the law, blah, 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 but I don't really think of them as very nice. So that's just a personal thing. Now, we've talked about threesomes or triads, and further triads occur. So a sign has icon, index, and symbol, at least described in the front end of my little yakking here. But when we get to purse starts describing all kinds of other stuff. That is, there's something like called a qualisign, a sin sign, a legisign, and the legisign is more interesting for where we're headed in the current moment, and that's how for the most part, economics can be overlapped or be connected with semiotics. And then there's the ream, the disassign, and the argumentassign or whatever. And of course, this won't be on the quiz, but you can, this can all be, as in an argument, you have all kinds of other things going on. And yes, this is an entire system of, this is Charles Sanders Peirce. Now, Peirce is thinking about this in the 19th century. And I think if we thought more about this in the 19th century than certain other things like war, I think or racism, we would probably be better off, but that's another story. So Peirce soon reserved sign to its broadest sense, that is, for index, the icon, and symbol alike, and eventually decided that symbols are not the only signs which can be called general signs in some sense. This whole idea of the general sign is probably no different than what Marx is saying about general knowledge or general intellect, but we won't go there now anyway. And so now, of course, you can imagine that Peirce, with all these ideas floating around in his head, of course, with all these neologisms, you can see that he'd go nuts. Maybe he was nuts. But, he defines 10 classes of sign, and there it is. And I draw your attention to the fifth column, which is examples. So there are different examples, and I just use a couple to hopefully give you the sense of why that actually is important in reality. So a feeling of red has a phenomenological category. It is an object of some kind. It does have an interpreter, etc. So a feeling of red, and that's of course, Wittgenstein talks about this red issue. At least in the philosophical investigations, and I don't know if he refers to it in the Tractatus, but anyway, this is important. It has epistemological stuff, and then of course a sin sign, and you can see why I have this obsession with little diagrams and stuff, but they function iconically. But they also have other kinds of meanings, and if you think about all of those other possible meanings, it's kind of a shorthand in that sense. And then you have other kinds of things that have indexicality, a spontaneous cry, a weathercock, a weather vane, or a photograph obviously has indexical elements. That is a picture of reality, but it is a picture in and of itself, and then it is also a picture of things, and a structured picture in many ways. But anyway, so yes, there's a Wikipedia page for it, so you can go nuts. And I probably did by just even including all those things. The point of it is that in talking about semiotics and economics, we're required, with all due respect, other fields. And one field among many is, of course, geology or eco-socialism or other interdisciplinary fields that take advantage of these ideas and things that aren't fully worked out. But, there's an entire, cult, tribe, constituency, peer group that, believes that there's something called the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene seems a little more useful in terms of, that humans have changed or alter our kind of relationship to the world, to to nature, uh, that and has impacts in that sense. So there's that. Some people want to elevate that to a capitalocene because we've gone to the next level of abstraction. We were able to use abstract ideas to exploit people, uh, uh, to build wealth, and particularly in ways that don't seem quite obvious. Most wealthy people don't have it all sitting in a money bin. It's in other kinds of things, whatever that might be. So some would argue that, particularly in terms of environment or ecology, is that Capitolocene's leading proponents argue for the centrality of capitalism in the making of climate crisis. The Capitalocene is a way to understand capitalism as a geohistorical process, not a geological event. See, already that's right. It's not simply synchronic, but it's diachronic, right? It has a history, and so for somebody like Andreas Malm, he's a you could call him an eco-socialist. He's a Marxist, among other things, and writes in a variety of places. So, and he's still alive, I think. This is the theory of fossil capital. Yes, there's a book on it. Uh, Good book, too. Good books. I mean, he writes all kinds of stuff. And for Jason W. Moore, it is the theory of cheap nature, quote unquote, cheap nature in the capitalist world ecology. Both argue with Karl Marx that capitalism is a labor process and a class struggle in what is referred to as the web of life. Now, that gets us into stuff that, we could argue out and whatever and go, get to talk about rhizomes and other stuff. But let's get back to the point here. While Malm sees the origins of climate crisis with the ascendancy of fossil capital after 1830, and you could even argue that too. Some of these folks argue that fossil capital really only becomes important after 1830, as opposed to the late 18th century with the invention of the steam engine. So steam engines sort of, they're kind of amusing and, kind of not become important, but they become obviously more important with its replacement of physical labor. So, and anyway, both agree with Marx that capitalism is defined by the imperative of endless capital accumulation, which is the deal, which implies increasingly serious metabolic antagonisms, because that's where it gets back to Marx. So I'll switch through. Anthropocene is given to us not too long ago by Paul Crutzen, and it's important, as I said, mentioned with the design of the steam engine. But then you can argue, as Malm does, that maybe it's not there. Maybe it's a little later than that, and it's more a 19th century idea. But anyway, and of course, you can see this through private correspondence. The Capitalocene spread to other scholars such as feminist Donna Haraway. Yeah, there's a whole thing about cyborgs possible there, and geographer Jason W. Moore. And so you can read the rest of this. So the point is that ultimately it builds down to certain other abstract ideas like relations of domination. So we began this little yakking here about the relation, the third thing, the thirdness, the relationship between two objects, one and two, and then there's a third thing, and that is relations of domination. Anti-capitalism, therefore, is a necessary but not sufficient step towards environmental equilibrium. This gets to the whole eco-socialist argument. Even a hypothetical socialist society in the future would still have to specifically tackle the problem of resource use. That's the underlying issue of eco-socialism, is that, there's this utopian idea that, everything would be fine if we could just, seize the means of production and blah, 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 make a classless society and all that. Maybe, but the resource use still underlies all of this. So it's a necessary step, but it's not sufficient in order to build our, a utopia or whatever. And of course, relations of domination between individuals, is the problem, and it's obviously the current problem in the United States. It may not get fixed um, because some people believe that they should dominate other people. So where I got to with this is a book that is not yet out, um, but we can sort of predict what it is from a variety of articles that Kenneth McGill has written. He's a scholar. He's at I think Southern Connecticut, although whatever. The Semiotics of Economic Value: A Pragmatic Approach is coming out in 2026, August, I think. And let me just read to you the description of this, because this, even though I may not get to it in the yammering about the real article I wanted to get to, because I won't, obviously, now. Is kind of this is the way it got pointed. But I came across McGill's work earlier because he does do this economic thing, but it's framed in a kind of anthropological way, which is fine, whatever. And it comes in within a certain set of ideas, mainly Peircean um, logic, as it were. So this book describes economic value. Remember, that's what we've been looking at all through this yammering about, is problems of how we describe or think about value, and in particular economic value, as a representational phenomenon. Because that's kind of what the whole thing is about. Is it how is it represented to other people or to ourselves? Why is it so problematic or variable or whatever? And whatever. When people represent value to themselves and to others, it provides an original and thorough account of value from a pragmatic and interactionist perspective. Interactionism as a whole sociological, anthropological thing. And you could argue, going back to analytic Marxism, that this is how or one way in which methodological individualism was formed, but countered in this case by thinking about pragmatism or pragmatic elements. And yes, pragmatic is only one of a trio. Yes, those three things again. That is, you have the syntactic, the semantic, and the pragmatic in when you talk about language. And in fact, the world is kind of like that too. We have order, we have meaning, and then we put them all together and we use stuff or activate stuff or act with stuff. So there are three things. And they are mirrored in our language. That is, there are semantic things, things that mean stuff to us and that we message with. Syntactic things, because we need to have everything orderly, like our language, like a sentence should appear in a certain order to make sense. And when it doesn't, they put you in the loony bin. And then there's the pragmatics of trying to do stuff. So McGill uses Peircean semiosis. Note that semiosis is a way of talking about that phenomenon that when you perceive signs. And yes, that's not the only way of thinking about it. The French call it semiology. So there's a whole nother set of ways. This is things that get argued out, and there are conferences for it. So you can deal with that in your own way. And other theoretical tools from linguistic anthropology, because that's kind of how it's been driven. Linguistics is its own science, but it is also applied in a variety of other fields and used in other fields, certainly psychology, sociology, literature, history, even, etc. In order to demographics, etc. In order to study economic value, he argues that economic laws are realized in situated interaction. So that's synchronic, right? As Peircean legisigns, you see, it's already gotten the jargon. And the situated indexical features of exchange are further described in relation to these laws as legisigns. See, we've already gotten bogged down in language as well. Connotation is killing us. But legisigns is kind of useful, and because that gets us to an entire body of interesting ideas that we don't have to go bogged down in the other stuff, and we can talk about as the law and political economy folks talk about. That is, ultimately, that's what the fight is over, is how do laws or rules affect economic action or activity or behavior. Such an approach is shown to have implications for the formation of interests and ideologies, ideology, the reification of labor, and the instantiation of markets through habit. So all that is there. Anthropology is there. Business is there from through the markets and marketing. Uh, Legal stuff, labor studies, all kinds of stuff, and so that's all there. And describing what goes on in this little book, offering some innovative tools for theorizing economic value in a new era. This volume will be of interest to, yes, anthropologists, linguists, and other scholars concerned with language semiotics and, yes, political economy. So these are the chapter headings. Semiotics of radical capitalism, Marx's law of value, a pragmatic reconstruction. There's a whole thing there. Habits, laws, and materiality. That's where habits and habitus, and there's a whole anthropological, sociological thing there. And whatever. State and social text, a whole bunch of things there. And then, of course, Sassarian approaches to economic value. So it's not all Peircean in that sense. It is the intersection, the index of Charles Sanders Peirce and Ferdinand de Saussure. So in terms of time I have left, I have no damn time left. Maybe next week I'll talk about the article itself, the article I referred to, which normally I do this for 90 minutes, and I can go 90 minutes, but I don't think I'll give you kind of the overview. It may go another half hour, so buckle in, strap in, buckle up, strap in, or whatever. So there's this collection in the semiotic inquiry sort of journal, the Recherche Semiotique. And it is a presentation. It's a collection of things on semiotics and economics, the quote-unquote general framework. Now, of course, there's a little thing there, but we won't refer to that. I've included the links, so you can do that. This front end, this introduction, is written by Carsten Hermann Piloth and Winifred Knauth, sorry. And it's from 2020, so this is not old stuff. This is actually pretty recent and very useful. And of course, this represents two very different kinds of universities, the University of Erfurt and the Catholic University of Sao Paulo. All right, so I'll read to the front end of this and note, of course, that I'm already planning ahead. And, I'm going to stop at 30 minutes after 7, which gets us to 90 minutes. I mean, that's the absolute end. I may end before that, simply because it's not moderately long, but and I think it's easy to read. And I've already made notes in it, so you can see what I thought was more important. So connections between semiotics and economics has been discussed for centuries in various philosophical contexts, but early writings on the topic remain mostly restricted to the relationship between goods exchanged for money and meanings communicated by means of words or messages. So you have all that there. Leibniz was an early semi-edition of economics with his reflections on the affinities and differences between the material values inherent in, yes, gold, coins, and coin-like tokens, as compared to the semantic values of verbal signs. You can see already this is, interesting stuff and very important, and obviously important for even someone like Marx, because he's sort of thinking, okay, well, I'll do chapter 1 and mainly focus on gold because that's easier for people to understand. But then as you get to merchant capital and financial capital, you're going to have to think about other things because it can't all be coins. And we know, of course, that coins should all weigh the same, but they don't, etc. And so Michel Foucault's order of things is a grand theory of representational aiming, among other things, at revealing the affinities, yes, like Leibniz, between economic and semiotic order in the cultural history from the Renaissance to modernity. It's a book I hope that our little pod can read together because it's actually a good book. And learning about Foucault and his particular approach to things is actually quite useful, even though Foucault has a lot of other things in his mind. He does actually influence a whole bunch of other folks and is a important historical force, although some people may not think so for a variety of other reasons, but that's a whole nother story. Bauer and Klemp Klimt give a general outline of such interrelationships between political economy and semiotics since Thomas Hobbes, which is a little past the Renaissance. In 20th century semiotics, the affinity between semiotics and economics has first been brought into view by Roman Jakobson. And that's a whole thing in and of itself. With reference to Claude Lévi-Strauss, who had anticipated the idea in some respects, Jakobson declared that both research fields, economics and semiotics, are concerned with the study of communication, although at different levels. While semiotics studies the exchange of messages, economics studies the exchange of utilities, namely goods and services, so that both approach the same kind of problems on different strategic levels and really pretend to the same field. Yes, they do on the one hand. On the other hand, they don't. And particularly if you, and this will come further on, that recall that when we compare Marxian or heterodox economics, utility theory is one whole direction that the field of economics went into, and it's kind of where, for a variety of because of other theorists, Marshall, blah blah blah, Evans, etc., is that utility theory or whatever underpins a certain moment, at least in neoclassical economics. All right, anyway. A perspective in economics is often interpreted as semiotic avant la lettre, can be found blah, 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 and there's studies that can be noted relative to Marx. In this chapter, Marx distinguishes between the use and exchange values. This is book one. Interprets the latter as a social hieroglyphic already, has semiotic import, whose meaning needs to be deciphered, decoded, and concludes that to stamp an object of utility as a value, big V value, is just as much a social product as language. Marx is thinking about this. He's going, how am I going to deal with this commodity thing? Because it's a pretty abstract idea, and not a lot of people get why that's important. But they can sort of see it operative when you start, describing other matters. So it's an object of exchange. A commodity comes into communication with another commodity and betrays its thoughts in the language of commodities in order to tell us that its own value is created by labor. Now, that's Marx. But, however, says Marx also, that the language of commodities always speaks of the exchange value of its hieroglyphics, never of their use value. So you can see automatically that Marx is tackling this abstraction problem. It having a thing and paying money for it, not always the same deal. And if you've ever spent time actually buying stuff, you'll note that the same object can have a wide variation in price, like our gasoline, for example, etc. Noting, of course, that the alternative electricity has its own range, but that's different. That's all. Mainly historical and terminological interest is that Saussure's contemporary Maffeo Pantaleone is an influential Italian economist of his time, postulated a semiologia or semiotica economica in the 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century. By this term, he designated a science aiming at bringing together economic facts susceptible to statistical expression. Recall that statistical analysis happens before this, certainly, and certainly numbers occur before this, and accounting occurs before this. But this is a kind of way in which you can, kind of talk more structurally. And of course, this is sort of the zeitgeist of the kind of idea of semiotics in that sense. And you don't have to go nuts about this, but that there is stuff there. And so Pantaleone wrote, et cetera, in French. Pantaleone thus conceived of statistical semiotics as a science whose task it is to interpret the symptoms of the facts and the tendencies hidden below statistical data collected by economists. Remarkably, historically, remarkable is the introduction of the terms semiology and semiotics into a sociological context 9 years before Navi introduced the term semiology. This is more French stuff, right? Remember, I said there's a difference between semiotics and semiology, or semiosis and semiology. But anyway, so in the first half of the 20th century, apparently without any influence from Marx and without any reference to Saussure, Karl Buhler, in chapter 4 by theory of his theory of language, proposed a semiotic or a sematological. Note, of course, that the idea of the semaphore occurs before this, that is using, semaphore signaling and blah, blah, blah. That's all sort of there. You can see it used in a very analog way, right? In France, the semaphores, used to transmit messages and also to defraud the economy. But anyway, that's another story. Interpretation of the system of commodity. I'm watching Count of Monte Cristo now, so it on television, so that's why this came to mind. Interpretation of the system of commodities demonstrate that, quote, the counterpart to significative contact is the exchange of goods. So you have the exchange of symbols or signs and the exchange of things. Goods in the system of economy are like the words of the system of language, he argues, when they become general types. Recall that we brought this up before. We talk about this, and legicides is a way of thinking about the kind of rule types ultimately of that activity, and cease to be mere singular tokens, that is, Peirce's sin signs. So Peirce is kind of talking about how you combine, he's talking about synchronic things, and he's also talking about diachronic things. He's talking about, what are the units of interpretation in that sense. Buehler's example is a cigarette brand of his time whose name was Khedive, whatever. Factories put a certain mark on cigarettes, chocolate, and soap, and guarantee of the cigarette, for example, that Khedive is Khedive. One item is like, so there's this, universalizing or formalizing or normalizing or standardizing. And needless to say, this idea of putting marks on stuff happens several centuries earlier. The first marks on packaging, occurs quite a number of centuries earlier, but that's a whole nother story. What makes goods and money different from verbal signs is the higher relevance of their materiality. Higher relevance of their materiality. This is the same type of abstraction that Marx is thinking about. I got to deal with this value thing. It's not identical to price. And what is its relationship to price? And ultimately, what is its relationship to labor, or labor power, or to energy, or to activity, or some other thing? So, quote, in verbal intercourse, the function of the words is more indifferent to the material, that is, more dematerialized, more abstract, than in the case of the dollar. It's pretty clear, right? Money is money. And, other things impinge on that. In sum, the concrete word, remember, concrete and abstract in Marx, the concrete word is a significative entity, whereas this is a, signifier versus signifieds, right? Whereas the dollar is and remains rooted among goods, though in its paper form, it does closely approach significative entities. I guess a simple example of that would be, difference between Federal Reserve notes or whatever, as opposed to silver certificates in terms of the dollar, whatever. For even if it cannot be eaten, one receives something for it in purchase, which in general cannot be said of the coinage of language, right? Talk is cheap in that sense. Since the relevance of semiotics to the foundations of economics came to the fore with Levi-Strauss and Roman Jakobson, and analogies and differences between linguistic science and material objects of culture were on the agenda of structuralist semiotics anyhow, generations of semioticians have approached the most diverse issues of economics from semiotic perspectives. So this is trying to connect all these damn things together, and they are kind of together now, but they aren't truly together because they don't teach. There's very few institutions that teach, for example, semiotics in graphic design, for example, or semiotics in web design. It's really unfortunate, but that's just the case because Anyway, semiotics of advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, semiotics, yes, of money. Semiotics has also been the framework within which economic issues have been approached in the context of cultural criticism, CDA, that is critical discourse analysis and media studies. In the West, during the second half of the 20th century, that is the post-war period, right? The formative period for that Western Marxism that's so anti-imperialist, the predominant research paradigm at the crossroads of semiotics and economics was structuralistic semiotics, which reached its climax of interdisciplinary influence in the 1970s. Yeah, that's probably true. It's really unfortunate uh, for those who managed. So those of us who managed to live past the 1980s. Anyway, so Sarah's concept of economic value, of semiotic value, his theory of the arbitrariness of the signifiers in relationship to their signifieds. You assign. There's a four-legged thing. This is standard in my lecture. There's a four-legged thing that goes woof, and yet it is a Shannon. It's a whoa in some other languages and a dog in others. So anyway, and his view of language as a semiotic system were the sources of inspiration for semiotics who wrote on the affinities between, and yes, I've been reading Rossi Landi since he was alive, linguistic semiotics and economics, that is Ferdinand Rossi Landi in the 70s, as well as on commodities, values, and the economy as a science system. And yes, there's a lot of discussion of these things. There's actually a whole body of literature for this. It just doesn't, for example, in the United States, it does get taught, which is, we're more the awful at a loss because of it. Whereas in Europe, there are whole nations that understand what that means. And anyway, with such methodological tools, semioticians pursued the purpose of ideological criticism and of unmasking the strategies of persuasion of the mass media in their alliance with powerful capitalist enterprises. In Eastern Europe, however, studies at the crossroads of semiotics and economics took a different direction. In times when critical discourse semiotics as practiced in the West was denounced as subjectivist, idealist, formalist, or bourgeois, note that these are the same words that the anti-imperialists make about the anti-imperialists. But anyway, and when research of the members of the Moscow and Tartu school semioticians was turned towards linguistics, literary and cultural studies, a technocratic alliance between economics and linguistics was briefly envisioned by leaders of the planned economy in Europe's communist bloc. So note that, at least for a couple of decades, they finally got around to doing this. And yes, that's ironic and contradictory because, of course, under Stalin, a lot of this got smashed during, the communism didn't do a lot of help. You can say that the foundations, for example, in one line of Moscow school semiotics was, sort of torn up and destroyed by, kind of the shift from a kind of humanist communism or humanist socialism to a something else, whatever that is, engineers of the soul, socialist realism and all that other prescriptive stuff. But the fact that that did happen, and it did affect not just simply fields that made cultural objects, but also in wholly other fields. Psychology got screwed, geography got screwed, all during the Stalinist period. Whatever. And it did it for reasons of the state, right? It's why, uh, gulags did not exist on certain maps. Let's put it one version of that. A document of the attempt of leading economists to instrumentalize semiotics for the purpose of improving the efficiency of their planned economy. And we've had this discussion before in the context of, Lysenkoism and linear programming and Leontiev, at least from a pseudo-Western point, from a different point of view on the issue of linear programming and organizing an economy, but that's a whole nother story. According to this project, the task of semiotics in the economic field of activity was the analysis and structuring of existing sign systems for more effective handling of the instruments for the control of economic processes. Now, you can see here that, if you could, put everything into tables, you would be actually fulfilling the same thing that Marx saw in the physiocrats, right? Hopefully you can see that, right? The whole thing of the tableau économique, comes to light back again from a Marxist point of view in, the only existing socialism, right? Anyway, an offspring of this tradition seems to be the formalist approach to economic semiotics developed in Romania. And yes, each, you could break it up into language groups. There's a Hungarian semiotics. There's clearly a Polish one. Uh, there's a Czech one, and there's obviously a French one. So it's a little weird, and getting all these things to talk to one another. When in fact, of course, the irony of this is that you want to create a more totalizing kind of product, but it doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. It postulates a semiotics of economics based on Charles Morris's semiotics. Uh, you can see when I mentioned syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, that is a semiotic triad, as well as talking about linguistic categories. So you can see Morris took it in a slightly different direction, because, of course, that it's a difference between Morris and Saussure is like crossing the English Channel. Anyway, and aims at axiomatizing, and axiomatic philosophy is not exactly the same, and it is a way in which we can talk about logical systems, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but it verges toward, and we can have a whole argument about that, the science of economics by means of tools from symbolic logic. Now, this is to say that it used to be the case that philosophy departments, had to get everybody who's doing formal logic or who needed to go to graduate school or whatever, is to know symbolic logic as if it were a language. And it's less so now, but interesting. And it is its own interesting set of things. And I wish that it had been taught, sooner. I wish I'd learned it in high school, for example. Anyway, as this overview reveals, even though a close connection between semiotics and economics was realized when both sciences were emerging, until today, the corresponding unified research program remains marginal to both. Yes, indeed, and maybe even judged to be declining. Well, the authors themselves, 1970s. The main reason is that different from semiotics proper, economics did not explore the semiotic dimension of economic action any further, which fits into the more general pattern of ignoring the role of language as well as of culture in the economy. Yeah. Or they shunt it aside, they marginalize it. It wasn't that long ago that marketing was not a field in business. I mean, it just wasn't identified as a field. They didn't give degrees in it, blah, blah, blah. And then even further, advertising was, not capable of being a subfield of marketing, whatever. So you can see how problematic, so at the disciplinary level, some things are. At the same time, the growing mathematical complexity of economics, yes, and the development of methods that differ fundamentally from semiotic research, such as econometrics. Now, I'm probably one of the very few people who thinks that it doesn't differ fundamentally. So that's where I'm going to go next. But I mean, in my own stuff. But anyway, heighten the barriers between the two disciplines. I would assert that there's a quite amusing overlap. But anyway, however, there's also a deeper philosophical reason for the situation. Interest in language has recently been increasing in economics, for example, in the context of, and this is close to where I'm going to end. But we were talking about narratives, and in our little pod, we look at short stories, etc. And there's a kind of unit idea that goes on. That is the difference, of course, between short stories and other forms, novelettes, poetry, whatever. note that narrative economics here is described by Nobel Prize winner Robert Shiller, I think. Anyway, this tendency goes hand in hand. What's interesting is, of course, economists who are talking about non or less economic things only wait until they get their Nobel Prize to start talking about that stuff, which is, I find that amusing and it's worth even an article. Because there are a whole bunch of economists who get their Nobel Prize, and then they suddenly decide they can talk about every goddamn thing on the planet, and it does interesting things. It's very important, but it's sort of weird and absurd because if they'd been talking about it earlier, they wouldn't. Well, maybe they wouldn't have gotten their Nobel Prize. But anyway, this tendency goes hand in hand with the rise of behavioral economics. Someone got needless to say, somebody got a a Nobel Prize in that. Here, the interesting point emerges that narratives, although certainly conceived as economic imaginaries that could be approached by semiotic methods, are mainly seen as dysfunctional. So, in effect, they're negating, the functional possibilities of that. So that's where it gets crazy. And so people like Schiller or Akerlof, who talk about this, have that sort of sitting in the back of their minds when they talk about it, and yet they think they can talk about it, which they do, and they actually contribute interesting things. Narratives have effect on economic behavior, but these are interpreted as biasing and distorting reality, apparently even confirmed in psychological experiments. And reality would be accessible to rational agents, whereas narratives lead them astray. Now, here you can see the entire division in analytic Marxism between problems of rationality and problems of narratives, which are then seen as quote unquote irrational, or the criticisms of analytic Marxism because it's too much like math, it's too much like game theory, it's all methodological individualism, blah blah blah. Anyway, and how are we doing on time? We have a few more minutes, and let me go slightly further, and then you can decide whether you want to do any more yammering about this. So the difference here is, of course, between micro behavior, Kahneman, who also has a Nobel Prize, macro phenomena that both Akerlof and Schiller have Nobel Prizes, are considered. Narratives belong to the what Marx also referred to as the quote unquote animal spirits that interfere with rational analysis and decision making. In other words, ordinary language, and this is an important point, and in fact, why J.L. Austin I would mention at the front end of this, ordinary language is considered the source of economic pathology, and you could prove that, but that's not the point. As a consequence, even innovative approaches such as narrative economics, and yes, this can go into rhetorical things and uh, certain other folks. There's a whole rhetoric in economics field that is worth talking about. We won't talk about them here because obviously we get to a point where it might not be able to work. Although I think it's worth looking at, particularly for a variety of other reasons. Particularly since certain people in it, that is the rhetoric, economics and rhetoric people, tend to be or approach a kind of weird conservatism. But anyway, that's another. Fail to take language seriously as a medium which is fundamental in enabling any kind of economic action in a complex division of labor that requires close coordination among millions of agents. That's always ultimately the problem, right? Problems of scale, problems of division of labor, etc. If at all, language is quote unquote cheap talk. Rational actors can, in principle, lift the veil of language. Recall that this veil thing is actually pretty important. Particularly, there's a whole literature. There's another thing, and I think it's a reference here or to some other place about Rawls and the veil of ignorance versus the veil. Well, anyway, lift the veil of language and see reality as it is. And so we're all back to philosophy again. In scenarios of cause and effect, they can identify the material incentives that other actors face. Thus, they can reconstruct their decision-making situation without relying on any kind of symbolic representation, which, after all, rational actors would exploit as a means of cheating and faking, which is exactly where the United States government is at the present moment. Um, it truly believes that it can fool you, that can gaslight you by saying what you see is not there. No, that's not happening. Inflation, no, not inflation. You're not paying more for gas and food, etc. There's no war, etc. This judgment is not only true for what is often referred to as mainstream economics, but even for strands of research that more explicitly refer to sign symbols and language in the economic process. Even these authors, however, do not explicitly discuss semiotics. And there's a whole literature there that, you won't see boo about sign stuff. Anyway, an important example is Aoki's theory of institutions, which argues that the information processing functions of institutions essentially builds on quote unquote public representations, i.e., signs. Here, signs would obtain a core position in understanding how institutions shape economic behavior. However, now there's a whole philosophical, rupture described here that is is embodied in one paragraph, but it's there, and we're talking about it some other moment. However, when discussing the role of language in the context of John Searle, analytic philosophy of institutions, Aoki tended to agree with the position articulated by Hendricks and Walla that ultimately what counts in determining behavior are incentives that are not mediated by language. Now, you see, this is that problem. If you presume things can only be explained by language or are determined or are more easily determined, this is the problem of artificial intelligence in the sense that, and the problem of it applied to things that are not textual, is to assume that mediation is different, or the whole point of doing semiotics is to say, well, mediation is everywhere. And to say that things aren't mediated by language is really being dopey, but that's another thing. This position emerges in many contributions, even of economists outside the mainstream, such as when discussing money, probably the most archetypical phenomenon amenable to semiotic analysis of the economy. And Duplessis has really good work on this. Duplessis, moves us further through this. We can conclude that the specific economic model of the rational agent in many respects blocks view on signs and semiotic processes in determine economic action and economic phenomena. And how are we doing on time? I have only a couple more minutes left. So there's lots of other blah, blah, blah here. And as you can see, and I may or may not talk about this next time, you can read this for yourself. But it concludes with semiotics and economics must rest on a common foundation in the sense of a general semiotics. Note that there are arguments, and no different, although, well, not no different, but structurally similar to general linguistics or general semantics, or world studies or whatever. Semiotics and economics must rest on a common foundation in the sense of a general semiotics able to integrate other sciences, right? This presumes, of course, that people would grant that semiotics is a human science and tie up with new developments in economics that integrate science selectively. And this is where it gets weird, because this is kind of Elon Musk territory. This is what the tech bros are about. Neuroeconomics. I don't want to go there completely, but it is pretty clear that there's other deterministic or fascist things going on that are interesting from a research point of view, but not so interesting from a human point of view. Well, not now anyway. Probably more interesting in, Blade Runner time. Anyway, this leads back to the early days when both economics and semiotics emerged as separate disciplines, and thinkers such as Saussure, clearly recognize their close affinity. I'm going to stop now because I can obviously yak for much longer, as long as my voice will give out. But let me thank you for your attention. I will put up in the chat the link to get to the piece, which I forgot to do. It was in Discord, but whatever. And so I'll thank you for your attention, and be here again next week at the same time. Be there or be square.